On March 8th, we celebrated International Women's Day. I made it clear then that I believe that just one day out of the calendar year, well, that should serve just as a reminder to women of what they have accomplished through the history of our species, and all of us could use a wake-up call as well. We can do a much better job in striving for gender equality every day of every year. Hi, I'm Chris May, host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada, and today we meet U.S. astronaut Shannon Lucid. This Day in Weather History.
The mission from which Dr. Lucid returns continues to cement the close and growing bonds of cooperation between the United States and the Russian space programs, something that we have worked very hard for. Not only the cooperation between our nation and Russia, but between our nation and other nations as well.
How about this story? March 24th, 1996, U.S. astronaut Shannon Lucid transferred to the Russian space station Mir from the U.S. space shuttle Atlantis for a planned 5-month stay. Lucid was the first female U.S. astronaut to live in a space station. Shannon, a biochemist, was initially assigned as a board engineer number 2. She performed numerous life science and physical science experiments during the course of her stay aboard Mir. But then, beginning in August, her scheduled return to Earth was delayed more than 6 weeks, partially because of last-minute repairs to the booster rockets. That's pretty important. But then, you guessed it, delayed by the weather. There was a hurricane standing between her and landing on Earth. So she was up there a little bit longer, but the longer it went on, the deeper into the record books she would dive. As it turns out, Shannon Lucid holds the single-mission spaceflight endurance record for a stay aboard the Russian space station Mir by an American astronaut. Remember that This Day in Weather History can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, for instance, you're listening to the full version of today's podcast on your favorite provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story here, go check out the podcast video short there on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Her return journey was finally cleared and the flight path was set for her return to KSC aboard the STS-79 Atlantis on September 26th of 1996. When her mission had been successfully completed, Shannon had traveled 75.2 million miles. That's roughly 121 million kilometers in 188 days, 4 hours, 0 minutes, and 14 seconds to be precise.
I think we all feel, at least, that we've gotten to know Dr. Lucid, watching her grin and bear it as the mission was extended, hearing her eagerness to see her family, her yearning for what she called the wind and the sun. Perhaps more than she knows, she has also set a remarkable example for a new generation of young Americans, and especially young girls all across this country who look up to her and now see new possibilities for themselves.
I gotta tell you something, her descendants are gonna have frequent flyer miles for so many generations to come. And I'm sure that when finally, on September 26th of 96, she returned to Earth aboard the Atlantis, she was thrilled.
And I am so thankful to everything that everybody did, and I'm glad to be home, and all I can say is Houston never looked so good. Thanks.
But as a scientist, an explorer, an astronaut, Shannon Lucid made a solid contribution to the betterment and longevity of our species. Thank you, Shannon Lucid, from This Day in Weather History. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on This Day in Weather History. Tomorrow, is March 25th, and I will feature another special edition episode of, hey, it's one of those theme stories called Weather and War. Tomorrow we go back to Iraq War Part 2 in 2003. It was on March 25th of that year when a low-pressure system kicked up a dust storm that, excuse the pun, swept over Iraq, bringing with it sand and dust from the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. On this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.